27 men died in 10 minutes on a dusty street in Arizona, and it all started because one brother refused to let another's murder go unpunished. The clock tower in Iron Ridge showed exactly 3:47 p.m. on October 15, 1881, when Jake "Thunder" Morrison stepped off the afternoon train and into what would become the bloodiest gunfight in Wild West history. He didn't come looking for trouble, he came looking for his brother Tommy. But trouble had been waiting for him like a loaded gun. You see, Jake Morrison wasn't just any cowboy. He was a man with a reputation that stretched across 3 territories, known for 2 things. He never missed what he aimed at, and he never walked away from a fight that needed fighting. But what happened in those 10 minutes would test every skill he'd ever learned and push him beyond anything he'd ever faced. Tommy Morrison had been working a mining claim outside Iron Ridge when his letters stopped coming 3 months earlier. When Jake finally rode into town to investigate, he found his brother's cabin empty, his mining equipment abandoned, and a wall of silence from every person he questioned. But Jake had a talent for reading people, and the fear in their eyes told him everything he needed to know. Tommy was dead, and whoever killed him was still running this town. What Jake didn't realize was that his arrival had been expected. Eduardo Castellanos, the man who controlled Iron Ridge through fear and violence, had been preparing for this moment since the day they buried Tommy in an unmarked grave. And he'd gathered enough firepower to make sure Jake Morrison would join his brother before sunset. The town felt wrong the moment Jake stepped off that train. Main Street was eerily quiet for a Saturday afternoon. Too quiet. Shop doors were bolted shut despite the good weather. Windows were shuttered tight. Even the Copper Dollar Saloon, which should have been bustling with miners and cowboys, seemed abandoned. But Jake could feel eyes watching him from every shadow, and his hand instinctively moved closer to the Colt 45 on his hip. What would you do if you walked into a town where everyone was too scared to look you in the eye? Tell me in the comments. Would you turn around and leave, or would you push forward no matter what was waiting for you? Inside the Copper Dollar, 5 hired guns sat around a table in the back corner, waiting. Their leader was William Deadeye Garrett, a thin, pale killer with cold blue eyes and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. When Jake pushed through those batwing doors, Garrett didn't even bother standing up. "You must be Morrison," Garrett said, taking a slow sip of whiskey. "I'm Deadeye Garrett. Been waiting for you." Jake's eyes swept the room, counting threats, calculating angles. "Where's my brother?" "Your brother made some poor choices. Got involved with the wrong people. Asked too many questions about things that weren't his business. The temperature in that room dropped 20 degrees. Jake's voice went deadly quiet. "I'm asking those same questions now." Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just the cold satisfaction of a predator who thought he had his prey cornered. "I figured you might. That's why Mr. Castellanos wants to have a word with you." Eduardo Castellanos emerged from the saloon's back entrance like he owned the world. A well-dressed Mexican man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of calm confidence that came from never losing a fight that mattered. Behind him walked 4 more gunmen, bringing the total to 9 armed killers, all focused on one man. The odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. "Mr. Morrison," Castellanos said, his English perfect despite a slight accent. "I understand you're looking for your brother. Unfortunately, Tommy Morrison is no longer with us." Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. "You killed him." "I defended my business interests," Castellanos corrected with a casual shrug. "Your brother discovered some irregularities in my mining operations. When he threatened to contact the territorial authorities, well, problems require permanent solutions. And I'm a problem too? You could be. Or you could be smart." Castellanos spread his hands in mock generosity. "Take your brother's body and ride out of Iron Ridge. Never come back. Never ask questions. Live a long, peaceful life somewhere far from here. 9 guns against 1. Any sane man would take the offer and ride away. But Jake Morrison had never claimed to be sane, especially when it came to family. "I've got a counter-offer," Jake said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "You tell me where my brother's body is buried. You compensate his widow for his lost income, and you surrender yourself to the territorial marshal." Castellanos laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "And if I refuse?" "Then we settle this the Western way." The tension in that room was thick enough to choke on. Garrett's men were shifting in their chairs, hands moving toward their weapons. Castellanos' bodyguards were spreading out, trying to surround Jake like wolves circling a lone buffalo. 9 against 1, Castellanos observed with amusement. "Those aren't favorable odds, senor." "Depends on who's counting." That's when the Batwing doors swung open again, and Sheriff Ben Rutledge walked in with his deputy, both men carrying drawn guns and grim expressions. "Here's where I need your help. If you were Jake Morrison in that moment, would you trust the local sheriff who might be corrupt, or would you assume he was working with Castellanos? Your answer in the comments could change how this story unfolds." "Afternoon, Eduardo," Sheriff Rutledge said casually, but his gun never wavered. "Heard you were having a meeting. Thought I'd join the conversation." Castellanos' eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This is a private conversation, Sheriff." "Nothing's private when it involves murder," Rutledge replied. He looked directly at Jake. "Found your brother's grave this morning, Morrison. Eduardo's boys weren't as careful as they thought." Jake felt a cold fury building in his chest like a prairie fire. "Where?" "Boot Hill, unmarked grave. But my deputy Frank here found something interesting buried with Tommy." Deputy Willis held up a leather-bound journal. "Your brother was keeping detailed records of Castellanos' operation. Silver theft, claim jumping, murder, all documented in his own handwriting." Castellanos' face darkened like a thundercloud. "That proves nothing that would stand up in any court." "Proves enough for the territorial marshal," Rutledge said. "He's already been contacted. He'll be here Monday morning with federal warrants for everyone involved." "Monday's 2 days away," Garrett interjected, his hand moving to rest on his gun handle. "Lot of things can happen in 2 days. Lot of people can disappear." That's when Jake realized the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about his brother's murder anymore. Castellanos was planning to eliminate all the witnesses and evidence before the federal authorities arrived. The sheriff, the deputy, Jake himself, they were all loose ends that needed cutting. "Gentlemen," Castellanos said, straightening his expensive jacket with deliberate calm, "it appears we have a situation that requires immediate resolution." He gave Deadeye Garrett the slightest nod. Everything exploded at once. Garrett's hand flashed toward his gun like a striking rattlesnake. His 4 companions lurched to their feet, chairs scraping and toppling as they drew their weapons. Castellanos' bodyguards moved with practiced deadly precision. Sheriff Rutledge and Deputy Willis spun toward the nearest threats, their own guns barking, and Jake Morrison, standing in the center of it all, drew his Colt .45 with the lightning-fast reflexes that had made him a legend in 3 territories. The first shot came from Jake's gun, a thunderclap that dropped Deadeye Garrett before the outlaw's weapon cleared leather. The second and third shots followed so quickly, they sounded like one continuous roar, taking down Sam Torino and Carlos Mendez before either man could return fire. But the remaining gunmen were professionals who'd survived dozens of fights. They scattered like startled quail, diving behind tables and chairs, creating deadly crossfire patterns that trapped Jake in the center of the chaos. The saloon exploded into violence. Bullets flew in every direction, shattering mirrors and bottles, splintering wood, filling the air with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The sound was deafening, a continuous thunder that could be heard blocks away. Jake rolled behind the piano as bullets chewed up the floor where he'd been standing. Sheriff Rutledge took a shot in the shoulder but kept firing, his blood splattering across the bar. Deputy Willis was pinned down behind an overturned table, reloading frantically as splinters flew around his head. In the first 3 minutes of gunfire, at least 40 shots were exchanged. The air was so thick with smoke that men were firing at muzzle flashes rather than clear targets. Glass crunched under boots as combatants maneuvered for better positions. That's when they heard the sound that would turn this deadly gunfight into something even worse. The thunder of horses galloping down Main Street at full speed. This is the moment where everything changes. What do you think is coming through those saloon doors? Reinforcements for Jake or more killers for Castellanos? Drop your guess in the comments, because what happens next will determine whether justice or corruption wins the day. The saloon doors exploded inward as 3 riders burst into the fight without dismounting. The first was Captain James Iron Horse Sullivan of the 7th Cavalry, still wearing his blue uniform and firing a military-issue rifle. Behind him came 2 of the most feared gunfighters in the territory, Marcus Blackjack Dalton and Samuel the Preacher Hayes. Tommy Morrison hadn't just been Jake's brother, he'd been their friend and fellow soldier. When word had spread through their network that Tommy was missing, they'd ridden hard to Iron Ridge, arriving just in time to turn a desperate last stand into a fair fight. "Jake!" Sullivan shouted over the gunfire, putting 2 rounds into an outlaw who was drawing down on Morrison. "We got your message." Jake's message. He hadn't sent any message. Then he realized Sheriff Rutledge must have contacted Tommy's old army friends when he found the body. The arrival of 3 more experienced gunmen shifted the balance instantly. Sullivan's military training showed as he coordinated their attack with hand signals. Blackjack Dalton lived up to his deadly reputation, his twin Colts speaking with lethal precision. The preacher, ironically the most religious man among them, was also the most dangerous, moving through the chaos like an avenging angel. Castellanos was shouting orders in rapid Spanish, but his men were falling fast. Snake Peterson tried to make a run for the back door and caught 3 bullets before he hit the wooden floor. A young gunslinger threw down his weapon and surrendered, hands high above his head. But Castellanos himself was far from finished. The crime boss had survived a dozen range wars and countless assassination attempts. He wasn't going down without taking some heroes with him. "Enough!" he roared, standing up from behind his improvised barricade, blood streaming from a graze across his forehead. "You want to know where your brother is buried, Morrison? Come and take me yourself." It was the kind of challenge that every man in that room understood. In the Old West, some fights came down to individual honor, no matter how many guns were involved. Jake stepped out from behind the piano, his Colt ready, his eyes locked on the man who'd killed his brother. The next few minutes would determine whether Jake Morrison lived to see another sunset. When Jake Morrison and Eduardo Castellanos faced each other across that smoke-filled saloon, every other gun in the room went silent. Even in the middle of a war, some duels were sacred. "Your brother died like a coward," Castellanos taunted, hoping to make Jake angry and careless. Begged for his life at the end like a whipped dog, but Jake's hand remained rock steady. His voice was calm as a winter morning. "Tommy never begged for anything in his life, but you're about to." They drew simultaneously. Castellanos was fast, faster than most men had a right to be. His nickel-plated revolver cleared leather in a heartbeat, the barrel swinging up toward Jake's chest with practiced precision. But Jake Morrison was faster. His Colt barked once, the sound echoing through the destroyed saloon. The bullet caught Castellanos in the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild into the ceiling. The crime boss staggered but didn't fall, blood streaming down his white shirt, his eyes still burning with murderous fury. "You think killing me ends this?" Castellanos gasped, struggling to stay upright. "I have men all over the territory. They'll hunt you down like a rabid dog." "Maybe," Jake replied, keeping his smoking gun trained on the wounded man. "But they'll have to catch me first." That's when disaster struck. Through the shattered windows came the sound Jake had been dreading. More horses, more men, more guns. The gunfire had drawn every outlaw and desperado within 50 miles to Main Street. At least 20 riders were approaching from both ends of town, trapping Jake and his allies in a building that was about to become their tomb. Captain Sullivan peered through a bullet hole in the wall and cursed under his breath. "Jake, we've got serious company riding in. Big, serious company." "How many?" Sheriff Rutledge asked, pressing his hand against his wounded shoulder to stop the bleeding. "Too many," Blackjack Dalton replied grimly, reloading both his weapons. "They've got us surrounded tighter than a tick on a hound dog. This is where I need to know what you're thinking. If you were trapped in a building with killers closing in from all sides, would you make a desperate last stand or try to negotiate your way out? Comment below because your choice might just save Jake Morrison's life. The outlaw army hit the Copper Dollar Saloon like a Category 5 hurricane made of lead and fury. Windows exploded inward as rifle bullets poured through from multiple directions simultaneously. What was left of the furniture disintegrated under the withering assault. Jake and his allies found themselves trapped in a building that was being systematically destroyed around them. "Back room!" Sullivan shouted over the deafening gunfire, his military experience taking over. "We need better cover or we're all dead men." They fought their way toward the saloon's rear, half carrying the wounded Sheriff Rutledge with them. Castellanos, despite his shoulder wound, was barking orders to his reinforcements through the broken windows, coordinating the attack that would wipe out every witness to his crimes. But Jake had spotted something behind the demolished bar that gave him a dangerous idea, the kind of desperate, crazy idea that might be their only chance of survival. Partially hidden by debris was a wooden case marked, "Danger, Mining Explosives." The previous saloon owner had probably used the dynamite for construction work, but in the right hands, it could level the playing field in one devastating blast. "Preacher!" Jake called to Samuel Hayes. "You still remember your demolition training from the war?" Hayes looked where Jake was pointing and grinned despite their desperate situation. "Like riding a horse, brother. Never forget how to blow things up." While Sullivan, Dalton, and Deputy Willis maintained covering fire, Hayes worked frantically to prepare the charges. Outside, the outlaw army was growing bolder, moving closer to the saloon as they realized their targets were pinned down like rats in a trap. That's when Jake Morrison made the most dangerous decision of his life, a decision that would either save them all or get them killed in the next 60 seconds. "I'm going out there," he announced, checking his remaining ammunition. "Going to draw their fire and give you boys a chance to light that fuse." "That's suicide," Sullivan protested, grabbing Jake's arm. "There's got to be 30 men out there, maybe more." 27, Jake corrected, having counted muzzle flashes through the smoke. "And they're all focused on this building. They won't expect someone to come out shooting." Sheriff Rutledge, despite his wound, grabbed Jake's other arm. "Son, you can't take on that many professional killers." Jake Morrison looked at each of his friends, good men who'd already risked their lives for him and his dead brother. Then he checked his guns one final time and said the words that would echo through Wild West legend. "Watch me." Here's the moment of truth. Jake Morrison is about to walk out into a street filled with killers to buy his friends time to blow up the building. Do you think he's being heroic or just plain crazy? Let me know in the comments what you think makes a man willing to face impossible odds for the people he cares about. Jake Morrison kicked open the saloon's front door and stepped into hell itself. What happened next would be talked about around campfires and in saloons for the next 50 years. Jake walked out into Main Street carrying a gun in each hand, his trusty Colt .45 and a captured revolver from one of the dead outlaws. He stood in the center of that dusty road, completely exposed to an army of killers, and opened fire like a man possessed by the spirit of vengeance itself. The first outlaw he targeted was perched on the roof of Muller's General Store, thinking he had a perfect sniper position. Jake's bullet caught him center mass, and the man tumbled to the street below like a sack of grain. The second shooter, crouched behind a water trough, took a round through the head before he could adjust his aim. But 25 other guns were swinging toward Jake now, and the air filled with enough lead to build a railroad. Jake moved like no man should be able to move, rolling, diving, using every piece of cover Main Street offered. He slid behind a hitching post as bullets chewed up the wood inches above his head, came up firing and dropped another outlaw. Rolled across the street through a hail of gunfire and put 2 rounds into a killer trying to reload behind a barrel. The outlaws were professional gunfighters, men who'd survived range wars and Indian fights, but they'd never faced anything like Jake Morrison in full fury. He wasn't just fast, he was smart. Every move he made drew their concentrated fire away from the saloon and toward himself, giving his friends the time they desperately needed. Inside the copper dollar, Samuel Hayes was working with steady hands to prepare the dynamite charges. 60 seconds, he called to the others, sweat pouring down his face despite the cool October air. Jake heard him and knew he had exactly 1 minute to stay alive against impossible odds. He sprinted toward the First National Bank building, bullets kicking up geysers of dust around his flying feet. A shot burned across his left arm, another grazed his ribs, but he kept moving like his life depended on it, because it did. He dove through the bank's front window in an explosion of glass and came up firing through the opening. 2 more outlaws fell to his guns, but Jake was bleeding now from multiple wounds, and his ammunition was running dangerously low. The killers were closing in from all sides, realizing that if they could take down the lone gunman, they could finish off his trapped allies at their leisure. With 30 seconds left on Hayes' countdown, Jake Morrison made his final desperate play. He ran back out into the street, drawing every gun toward himself like a lightning rod, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Come on, you yellow-bellied cowards! Let's finish this dance!" This is it, the moment that will determine whether Jake Morrison becomes a legend or a cautionary tale. With seconds left before the explosion, surrounded by killers, bleeding from multiple wounds, do you think he can survive long enough for his plan to work? Tell me in the comments if you think Jake Morrison has what it takes to pull off the impossible. The remaining outlaws poured everything they had into Main Street. Jake Morrison danced between the bullets like a man touched by divine madness, his own guns speaking thunder and death with every shot. He was hit twice more, once in the leg, once across the scalp, but he kept fighting with the determination of a man who knew his brother was watching from beyond. With 15 seconds left, Jake had only 3 bullets remaining and at least a dozen outlaws still shooting at him from every direction. With 10 seconds left, he could see Castellanos himself limping out of the saloon's back door, a rifle in his hands, drawing a careful bead on Jake's chest. With 5 seconds left, Jake's strength was failing fast, blood loss making his vision blur and his hands shake. That's when Samuel Hayes lit the fuse and shouted the words that would end the deadliest 10 minutes in Wild West history. "Fire in the hole!" The Copper Dollar Saloon erupted like a volcano struck by lightning. The explosion was visible from 10 miles away, a column of fire and smoke that rose 300 feet into the Arizona sky. The blast wave shattered every window in Iron Ridge, knocked men off their feet 4 blocks away, and created a crater where the saloon had stood just seconds before. The sound was like the world ending, a roar that echoed off the mountains and sent every bird and animal for miles running for cover. When the smoke finally cleared and the ringing in everyone's ears stopped, Iron Ridge looked like a battlefield. Jake Morrison lay unconscious in the middle of Main Street, bleeding from half a dozen wounds but miraculously still breathing. Around him, scattered like broken dolls across the dusty ground, were the bodies of 27 outlaws and hired guns. Eduardo Castellanos was found beneath a pile of burning timber, killed instantly by the explosion he'd helped create. Deadeye Garrett and his crew were buried under what had once been the saloon's roof. The blast had been so powerful that it took out not just the Copper Dollar but also the adjacent buildings where many of the outlaws had taken cover. Those few killers who survived the gunfight were finished off by falling debris or the concussion from the explosion itself. In exactly 10 minutes of violence, more men had died in Iron Ridge than in most entire range wars. It was carnage on a scale that the Wild West had never seen before, and would never see again. But the real story wasn't the body count. It was what happened next. Jake Morrison spent 3 weeks recovering from his wounds in Doc Peterson's clinic. When he finally opened his eyes, he found Sheriff Rutledge sitting beside his bed, his own arm in a sling but alive and healing. "How many?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. 27 confirmed dead," Rutledge replied solemnly. "Plus Castellanos and his entire operation. You and your friends didn't just win a gunfight. You cleaned out the biggest criminal empire in the Arizona territory. My brother? We found Tommy exactly where Castellanos said he would be. Gave him a proper burial in the town cemetery with military honors. The territorial government is paying for a marble headstone. Seems Tommy's journal contained evidence that helped convict 6 other crime bosses across 3 territories." Jake tried to sit up and immediately thought better of it. "The others? My friends? Captain Sullivan's got a busted arm, but he'll mend. Blackjack took a bullet in the shoulder. Says it's the worst wound he's had since Gettysburg. The preacher walked away without a scratch, claims God protects the righteous in their holy work. Deputy Willis is fine, just some cuts from flying glass. And you?" The sheriff smiled through his exhaustion. "Lost some blood, gained some respect. Iron Ridge is a different town now, Morrison. Peaceful. Honest folks can walk the streets again without fear." Jake nodded slowly, processing everything. The price had been terrible. 27 lives lost in 10 minutes of violence. But sometimes that's what justice cost in the Wild West. Sometimes good men had to become killers to protect the innocent. "There's something else," Rutledge added. "The territorial marshal wants to offer you a permanent position. Seems there are other towns out there that could use a man with your particular talents and moral compass." Jake Morrison looked out the clinic window at the main street of Iron Ridge. Where the Copper Dollar Saloon had stood, the townspeople were building a new church. Children played safely in the dust, where 27 men had died fighting for control of their community. The hanging platform where an innocent girl had nearly died had been torn down and replaced with a small park. Families walked freely down streets that had been controlled by fear and corruption just weeks before. "Maybe I'll take that job," Jake said quietly, watching a young mother push her baby in a carriage past the spot where he'd made his desperate last stand. "But first I need to heal, and then I need to visit Tommy's grave." The deadliest 10 minutes in Wild West history were over, but Jake Morrison's legend was just beginning. Word of the Iron Ridge gunfight spread across the territories like wildfire. Outlaws began changing their plans when they heard Thunder Morrison might be coming to their towns. Honest sheriffs started requesting his assistance with their worst criminal problems. But Jake never forgot the lesson of those 10 minutes. That justice often came at a terrible price, paid in blood and measured in the lives of men who chose to stand up when it would have been easier to walk away. Here's my final question for you. Jake Morrison could have taken Castellanos' offer and ridden away safely, but he chose to fight for justice instead. In your own life, when have you had to choose between the easy path and the right path? Share your story in the comments, because we all face moments where we have to decide what kind of person we want to be. And somewhere in the distance, in another corrupt town that needed cleaning up, other criminals were about to learn why they called him Thunder Morrison, and why smart outlaws changed their plans when they heard his spurs coming down the street. Because in the Wild West, legends weren't born from the stories men told. They were forged in moments of impossible courage, when good men faced evil odds and chose to fight anyway. The only question was, where would Thunder Morrison ride next? Subscribe and hit that notification bell to find out, because Jake Morrison's adventures in bringing justice to the lawless frontier are just getting started. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when he rides into Deadwood, where the corruption runs deeper and the stakes are higher than anything he faced in Iron Ridge.